There was a desk, small, wooden, and seemingly harmless. Maybe you remember it. Maybe you can still feel the shape of it beneath your hands. Smooth in some places, chipped in others. It was your first seat in the theater of obedience. You didn't know it then, but that desk wasn't built for learning. It was built for containment. Not the kind with walls or locks, but the kind that slips beneath your skin and teaches you, quietly, to be watchful of yourself. This was never about education. Not really. It was about formatting. Michel Foucault called it the making of docile bodies, and that's what you were becoming. Not just a student, but a subject, conditioned to sit still, to raise your hand, to ask permission before even needing anything. The desk was a symbol, yes, but also a tool, a silent architect of your inner cage, a place where surveillance didn't need cameras, because the real victory wasn't in watching you. It was in making you watch yourself. And so began the illusion. You thought you were learning math, language, structure, but you were being formatted for something far more invisible, the art of performance, the power of being acceptable. Machiavelli would have called it the training in appearances. You learned that it's not truth that keeps you safe, but how well you perform truth. Smile when spoken to. Answer what they want to hear. Praise the system, even if it stifles you. Because rebellion, even in silence, has a cost. But this wasn't brute force. No one screamed. No one hit. The breaking was more elegant than that. It came in routines, in repetition, in the silent pressure to conform. Schopenhauer would have seen it, the way the will is not destroyed in moments of violence, but in the long, slow erosion of one's right to feel freely. One bell at a time, one red pen at a time, one obedient smile at a time. And yet, this isn't about blame. No teacher meant to cage you. No school declared war on your mind. But systems don't need villains to be violent. They only need repetition. You were too young to resist. Too young to know that what was being shaped wasn't just your handwriting, but your sense of self. You began to mistake submission for virtue, obedience for intelligence, approval for worth. And now, years later, you wonder why you feel so lost in adulthood. Maybe it's because your compass was broken before you knew what direction meant. Maybe it's because you were domesticated, in ways that no one saw, and even fewer would dare question. You weren't weak. You were shaped. You weren't passive. You were taught to survive by being small. And now, the world asks why you can't find your fire. But the real question is, how could you, when it was extinguished before you even learned to hold the match? Let me ask you this. Do you remember the first time you sat at that desk? Because the desk hasn't disappeared. It just changed form. Now it's your routine, your fear of judgment, your hesitation before speaking your truth, the invisible rulebook you still follow, even when no one's watching. But the moment you see it, really see it, the structure begins to shake. Awareness is the beginning of rebellion. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The one that says, I see what shaped me, and I am not that shape anymore. 1. The classroom as a prototype of the prison. There's a reason why schools look so much like prisons. The long corridors, the bells that dictate movement, the rows of desks aligned like silent soldiers. You thought it was normal, but it was never neutral. It was a blueprint, not for education, but for control. A child doesn't know how to question a schedule. A child accepts the bell, the chair, the silence, not because it makes sense, but because it's the only world they're given. And so it begins, not with punishment, but with posture. Sit straight, hands on the desk. Don't speak unless called upon. This is how the architecture of control embeds itself in the body before it ever touches the mind. Your first lessons weren't about knowledge. They were about containment. You were being trained to occupy space without disturbing it, to move only when permitted, to think only within the boundaries provided. Foucault warned us, the most effective form of power is the one that no longer needs to be enforced. The panopticon, A structure where the possibility of being watched is enough to make you self-regulate. That's what the classroom became. You didn't need someone yelling to feel the weight of obedience. You just needed the fear of being noticed for the wrong thing. The teacher didn't have to say a word. You monitored yourself. You adjusted, you adapted, until the watchtower lived inside your own skull, and it never really left. That inner gaze, the one that checks if you're being too much, too loud, too honest. It was born there. You carry it now, as an adult. In meetings, in relationships, in dreams you don't chase because they might look foolish. You don't even realize you're censoring yourself, because it feels so natural, so automatic. But that's the point. You've internalized the guard. The tragedy isn't just that we were controlled. It's that we became our own captors. The very spontaneity that once made us alive, laughing too loud, asking too many questions, moving with curiosity, became reasons for shame. You learned early that rebellion isn't punished with violence. It's punished with exclusion. And so, you stopped. What did it cost you to be that good? Because now you hesitate. You overthink. You wait for permission that never comes. You want to feel free. But the prison is invisible, made not of walls, but of habits so old they feel like personality. You don't need a warden anymore. You've become one. And that's the most dangerous kind of captivity. The kind that doesn't look like captivity at all. 2. The mistake of equating obedience with intelligence. There's a subtle betrayal that happens early. You don't notice it when it begins. It starts with gold stars, with smiles of approval, with the warmth of belonging. But beneath those small rewards is a lesson far more corrosive. The idea that being right is more important than being real. That memorizing is more valuable than understanding. That being quiet is a virtue, and questioning is a risk. You weren't taught to think. You were trained to repeat, to pass, to conform. The children who memorized answers were praised. The ones who asked why were labeled as distractions. So you adapted. Not out of cowardice, but out of survival. You learned the rules. You played the game. And slowly, you started mistaking the game for life itself. That's the wound no one talks about. The trauma of being a good student. Because it doesn't end when school does. It bleeds into adulthood, into workplaces where silence is rewarded, into relationships where compliance is mistaken for love, into an inner life where success is defined by how well you match someone else's rubric. But here's the quiet truth. Your intelligence was never in your grades. It was in your questions. The ones you silenced to fit in, the ones that felt dangerous to ask, the ones that threatened the order you were trying so hard to please. You betrayed something sacred, not out of malice, but out of fear. You learned to abandon your inner compass to chase safety in the eyes of others. And now, you wonder why you feel so distant from your own thoughts, why you don't trust your intuition, why you doubt your creativity. It's because intelligence was replaced by obedience. And obedience doesn't require understanding. It only requires performance. And yet somewhere inside you, beneath the polished responses and practiced restraint, there is still a part that remembers. The part that used to wonder. The part that asked, not to rebel, but to know. That part didn't disappear. It was buried. Under years of nodding when you wanted to question. Smiling when you wanted to scream. And that's the real loss. Not the grades, not the achievements, but the quiet silencing of your own inner voice, until even you stopped listening. 3. Why your peace feels like emptiness. There comes a moment, maybe in your 20s, maybe later, when everything feels still, but not in the way you imagined. You've followed the rules. You've become reliable, measured, calm. People admire your composure. They say you're grounded, disciplined, mature. But inside there's a silence that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like absence. Like you've forgotten how to feel anything real. This isn't the stillness of wisdom. It's the stillness of suppression. You didn't arrive here by healing. You arrived here by muting every part of yourself that once felt too much. the anger that was punished, the curiosity that was redirected, the joy that was labeled distracting. Over time, you trimmed yourself down to what was acceptable. You became pleasant, efficient, predictable. But underneath that calm is a kind of ache, a hunger that doesn't know its name. You wake up, go through the motions, tick off the boxes, and yet, something feels hollow. You think it's your job, your relationship, your routine. But it's deeper than that. It's the cost of decades spent silencing the noise inside, until even your own desires sound foreign. You learn to avoid conflict so well, you stopped knowing what you actually want. You learn to regulate your emotions so deeply, you can't tell the difference between self-control and numbness. And when someone asks how you feel, you hesitate. Not because you're hiding, but because you genuinely don't know. That's the tragedy of adaptation. You survive by shrinking. You cope by flattening. You perform normalcy so well, you forget what it feels like to be alive. And yet, something inside remembers. A flicker, a pulse, a whisper. It shows up in the moments you can't explain. A sudden urge to disappear, a tear without a reason, a sharp frustration at your own apathy. These aren't weaknesses. They're signals. Proof that the self you buried is still trying to breathe. The truth is, you don't want comfort. Not really. You want intensity, clarity, permission to feel without shame. Because the deepest kind of peace isn't the absence of emotion. It's the presence of your full self, raw, unruly, unfiltered. And that version of you is still in there, waiting, not to be fixed, but to be felt. 4. The persona you built to survive now keeps you trapped. It began innocently enough. You smiled when they wanted you to smile. You spoke when it was safe. You learned quickly that approval wasn't given freely. It had to be earned. So you crafted a version of yourself that was easier to love, quieter, smarter, more agreeable. You didn't call it a mask back then. You called it growing up. But it was a mask. One carefully stitched from moments of disapproval, of misinterpretation, of subtle rejection. Jung called it the persona, the face you show the world, the one built not from your truth but from what the world rewards. And at the beginning, it saves you. It helps you belong. It lets you survive. But masks have a cost. The more you wear them, the harder it becomes to take them off. You start forgetting what your real face looked like. You start confusing the applause for affection. And eventually, the applause becomes addictive. You curate your presence. You manage perceptions. You stay within the boundaries of who they expect you to be. And it works. You become respected, polished, impressive, but not seen. Because what they admire is the version of you that was designed to be admired, not the messy, honest, contradictory self beneath. The one who doesn't always have answers. The one who gets angry. The one who longs for something deeper than performance. This mask, this persona, didn't form in a single moment. It formed at the desk, in the classroom. In every moment where you learned that being too much meant being alone, so you shrank, you edited, you survived. But survival isn't the same as living. Now, as an adult, you find yourself surrounded by people who know the mask, but not you. They love your reliability, your intelligence, your control. But do they know your fear, your chaos, your secret hunger to break free from the very image that earned their love? And this is the paradox. The very strategies that protected you are now the ones that imprison you. You've adapted so well that even your own soul feels like a stranger. You've performed strength for so long that you've forgotten how to be weak without shame. But weakness isn't the opposite of power. It's the door to authenticity. And maybe, just maybe, the self you've hidden all these years isn't dangerous. It's just honest. It's just waiting for you to stop performing long enough to come home. 5. The illusion of the normal life. You were promised that if you followed the path, studied, worked hard, behaved, you'd arrive somewhere meaningful, somewhere stable, somewhere called a good life. And so you walked that path, sometimes with hope, sometimes with doubt, but always with the belief that eventually normalcy would feel like peace. But it doesn't. It feels flat, like you're living someone else's idea of fulfillment. You wake up on time, you meet expectations, you collect achievements. But when the noise fades, when the room is quiet, when the screen goes dark, you're left with a feeling that won't leave. Something's missing. Not outside, inside. Foucault didn't just speak of discipline. He spoke of normalization, the process by which systems decide what is acceptable, valuable, worthy. And those standards are rarely born from wisdom. They're designed, manufactured by institutions that benefit from your compliance, from your functionality, not from your freedom. And so normal becomes a cage dressed as comfort. You chase milestones that weren't born from your soul. You perform roles that reward you externally, but starve you internally. You check boxes while your spirit starves, not for lack of success, but for lack of truth. Because success, in the language of normalization, is measured by how well you've suppressed your difference, how quietly you've sacrificed your authenticity, how convincingly you've worn the costume of contentment. The tragedy isn't just that you feel hollow, it's that you blame yourself for it. You think you're ungrateful, broken, lost. But the truth is simpler. You were taught to run a race you never chose, and now you're wondering why the finish line feels like another starting point, why your victories feel like obligations, why your life, on paper, looks full, but feels so unbearably empty. The system doesn't care if you're fulfilled. It only cares if you function. And when you finally realize that, when you stop mistaking productivity for purpose, a quiet grief begins to surface. The grief of a life spent meeting standards that never saw you, that never asked who you were beneath the performance. You weren't meant to be normal, you were meant to be whole. And wholeness doesn't come from ticking boxes, it comes from breaking them, from walking away from the metric that never included your soul in the first place. 6. The death of power in the age of eternal assessment. Power used to mean something else. It wasn't always about dominance or status. Real power was once the ability to act from your center, unapologetically, clearly, without waiting for permission. But now, that kind of power is vanishing, not because it's forbidden, but because it's constantly evaluated, constantly observed, constantly curated. And what is curated cannot be free. You live under an invisible eye, not one imposed from above, but one cultivated within. The inner judge, the voice that analyzes every word before it's spoken, every gesture before it's made, every dream before it's chased. You can't move without wondering how it will look, how it will be received, what it might cost in terms of perception. This isn't paranoia, it's conditioning. You grew up being graded, not just academically, but socially. Approval became currency. And over time, you stopped asking, "Is this true for me?" and started asking, "Will they like this version of me?" Even your rebellion became a performance, calculated, stylized, safe. You've been evaluated for so long that even solitude doesn't feel like relief. It feels like failure, like absence, like disconnection from the stage you were trained to depend on. And the stage is everywhere now, on your phone, in your career, in your mind. Machiavelli understood that true power cannot coexist with the need for constant approval, because when your actions are shaped by how they will be received, they are no longer yours. They belong to the crowd. And the crowd is never loyal. It forgets quickly. It praises conditionally. It demands endlessly. The enemy isn't judgment, it's self-abandonment, the kind that happens slowly, imperceptibly. Each time you suppress an impulse to maintain your image, each time you hesitate to be real, because being real might not be well received. Over time, you forget what it feels like to move from your own truth, not from expectation. And so your will, that force Schopenhauer saw as life itself, is no longer wild or sovereign. It's been hijacked, rewired. It doesn't move toward what's meaningful. It moves toward what's acceptable, what's admired, what's safe. But safe is not alive, and approval is not power. Power is what remains when the need to be liked finally dies, when the performance collapses, when you act not to be seen, but because you see yourself, clearly, deeply, without apology. That is the kind of power they never taught you, because it cannot be graded, and it cannot be controlled. It was never just a desk. It was an altar where your freedom was quietly rewritten, where you learned that stillness meant safety, and silence meant love, where the seed of self-surveillance was planted, not by force, but by repetition. And now, even as you move through adulthood, that desk lives on, in your habits, in your choices, in your fear of being fully seen. Foucault was right. The most profound chains are the ones you carry inside, the ones that don't need guards because you've already absorbed their gaze. And this realization isn't meant to shame you, it's meant to free you. Because once you see the structure, you're no longer at its mercy. Once you name the script, you no longer have to play the role. You keep thinking you need a new job, a new path, a new life. But maybe what you need is simpler. Maybe you just need a new lens, one that reveals how much of your identity was inherited, not chosen. How much of your routine is a ritual to keep the mask intact. How much of your suffering was never yours to carry. It was designed to keep you useful. Machiavelli knew that the deepest revolutions are not public. They are private, quiet, often invisible. They begin not with shouting but with seeing, with recognizing that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "You don't have to be this anymore." And Schopenhauer, ever the realist, would remind us that suffering is inevitable. But to suffer for someone else's comfort? To live a life scripted by systems that never cared about your soul? That is a tragedy you no longer have to accept. You were trained to sit still, to comply, to be good. Now, learn to stand. Not for attention, not for applause, but because standing, even alone, is the beginning of becoming real.